The popular histories of Nazi Germany, like that of Adolf Hitler and World War II, well, they are probably more interesting to study. The Nazi seizure of power is key in understanding how the Nazis influenced the population and how the population took in that influence and eventually ended up voting for the Nazis in masses. The Nazi seizure of power, written by William Allen, takes place between 1922 and 1945 in the small town of Nordheim and is really a reflection of what was going on all across Germany. Now, the book is split up into two different parts. Pre-1933, which takes place between 1922 and 1933, and is pre-Chancellery. It's the Nazis gaining power and influencing people to vote for them. And then post-1933 is 1933 to 1945, and once the Chancellery is established, once the dictatorship is established, and things like World War II and the Holocaust go on. Now, the pre-1933 era is broken up into two parts. The first point being the KPD and the SPD's inability to unite against the Nazis. The second point being the propaganda and the violence that the Nazis used to gain mass support. And the third point being the exploitation of the middle class by the Nazis. Now, the KPD and the SPD's histories aren't very good to start with. The KPD leader in the Weimar Republic was assassinated by an SPD member in around 1918. So the two didn't really see eye to eye and really have good relations with each other. But their lack of understanding of the Nazis is what really kept them from uniting against the Nazis. This is because the Nazis really didn't focus on a few ideological tenets to preach about. They were really wishy-washy in their politics. They would jump around and see what the population was interested in and really attack that. And this kept the KPD and the SPD really understanding, what the Nazis were about, what their main points are, what their goals were. And eventually they found out, a little too late, that their goal was the dictatorship and a dictatorship in Nazi Germany and the establishment of a Third Reich. Next was the propaganda and the violence that the Nazis used that influenced the populations in Nordheim and other places. Mass rallies took place weekly, if not daily, in Nordheim. There was mass speeches that took place in the Nine-Tatter Zelt almost all the time, and the marches and the parades and the bands also caught the eye of a lot of people in Nordheim who were leaning right or maybe thinking about voting Nazi. But these mass rallies also appealed to religion. They used Lutheran speakers, which Lutheran was the main religion around Nordheim, and they appealed to that. And so many of the Lutherans in Nordheim appealed to that, and they thought, hey, the Nazis have sort of the support of the Lutherans, so maybe I should support them too. Their speeches also always had a point. Nazi speeches always exploited some sort of weakness in the German population that they saw, whether it be the fear of a communist takeover or the exploitation of the middle class, the fear of depression. And it's those things that were exploited that gained the attention of a lot of people thinking about voting Nazi, or maybe that were on the fence to start with. And lastly, the exploitation of the middle class is something that the Nazis used to gain influence. Now, the middle class was surrounded by the lower class, and they saw day to day that the effects of the depression on the lower class were really devastating. The lower class was losing jobs left and right. They needed to be supported by the government. They had to go to soup kitchens. They lived in barracks. And the middle class feared that. And so it's that fear that the Nazis played off of. And Allen even mentions that the bank records of the time, although not shown with the public, but realized now, many of the middle class people, hundreds of bank accounts were open in the middle class, and upwards of 500 marks could be found in some of these bank accounts. So really, they had no chance of really being affected by the depression, but it was their fear that the Nazis played off of, their fear of ending up like the middle class, not having jobs, not having food, that the Nazis played off of. And eventually they kind of saw the Nazis as, hey, if we don't want to end up being depressed like the lower class, or if we don't want this depression to affect us, then maybe we should vote Nazi. They're the way out. Now, moving on to post-1933, Allen has two main points, which is the atomization of society and the reign of terror that the Nazis used. Now, the atomization of society is key in understanding how the Nazis split off individuals and kept social interaction and kept any sort of insurrection from being formed, and which is what the Nazis really didn't want, or any dictatorship does not want, any sort of rebellion. Now, the atomizations of society really that Allen is trying to explain here is the lack of social interaction. So each individual person was atomized. They were split off, and that they didn't really communicate with anybody outside themselves and maybe the people living in their household. And the first target of this atomization were Jews. In Nordheim, especially, and other places, Jewish shop owners were targeted by SA and SS men. Their shops were vandalized, they were boycotted, and so it affected them financially. They didn't have any business coming in because of fear that the SA or SS would attack the people that would patronize them, or maybe they would come after them next. And so once it did affect them financially, they really didn't have any reason to go to their business or socially interact with other people, because other people feared what the SA or the SS would do to them if they were caught patronizing these stores. And so the Jews were really outcasted from society in places like Nordheim and other places where Jewish establishments were. The next focus of the atomization of society were clubs. Social clubs were a huge part of German society, and things like sports clubs and chess clubs were in abundance. And so it was the Nazis' targeting of these types of clubs and the atomization of these clubs that really prevented any sort of talking about an uprising or anything like that against the Nazis. The Nazis basically gave these clubs two ways out. They could either elect a Nazi official, which basically you're Nazifying your club. You're saying, hey, we kind of support the Nazis. And then eventually being under this Gleichschaltung, which is basically the combination of multiple parties. So maybe all the chess parties would be combined into one and then put under one Nazi head, which really prevented any sort of rebellion or socializing about rebellion to take place. Or you had the choice of dissolving your party, which many people did. Many people saw Nazifying as worse than dissolving their party. And so if you were to dissolve your party, you would really just stay at home. You no longer had a purpose of going out and socializing with other people. You no longer had anybody to talk to about your interests or anything like that, which is exactly what the Nazis wanted. They wanted to single off individuals and keep any sort of talk of revolution, or maybe even just disliking the Nazis or talking about Hitler's mustache, from happening. They didn't want that at all. And so they succeeded in this, and many of the people no longer had any social connections outside of maybe their household. Because as we can see, social connections can sometimes be a bad thing. For instance, the French Revolution, social connections led to that, and also the Bolshevik Revolution, communism. The other point for post-1933 is the reign of terror that the Nazis had. Frequent home seizures and searches and seizures of people's homes, whether even if you had anything, they could just do it randomly. And of course, we look at that as today as, whoa, you can't do that. You need a search warrant to be able to search my home. But the searches were arbitrary. Any SA or SS man could walk in your home any time during the day and search yourself. And so this was fearful for a lot of people living in Germany, because they didn't know if they would find anything that would technically be contraband, and maybe they would be sent off to places like concentration camps or taken away to jail. And that brings me to my next point, which is protective custody. Protective custody was brought about because of the Reichstag fire decree, and it basically allowed for any SA or SS man to arrest anybody for really any reason, even if you just gave them a bad look, and they would take you off to places like jail or concentration camps, and really you wouldn't be heard from again, unless you were released, of course. But the reason Nazis released people was to, once again, instill fear into the population. So they might have seen their friend getting tortured in one of these camps, and they would talk about that, which would keep everybody in line and keep them from doing anything that maybe the Nazis didn't like. And so these two things really controlled the Nazi population, and is really Allen's two main points of post-1945 of control of the Nazi population. The Nazi seizure of power is something that's very crucial in understanding why the Nazis were successful in gaining power and how they ended up keeping power in Nazi Germany. And it is one of the most influential pieces of information about Nazi Germany and how it was established and how it was kept throughout 1922 and 1945.